Hello and welcome to another episode of the Project Purple podcast. I'm Dino Vrelli, founder and CEO of Project Purple, and we have another interview for you coming up with a very special guest after a few quick updates. It's crazy as we record this, it's the beginning of June and we're already halfway through 2023, which has been off to an amazing start. 2022 was a record year for us and we are so excited. Many of our fall marathons, crazy, we're talking about the fall, it's here in June, are already full with our Chicago, New York teams, completely sold out, but we do have spots. Still, we have a couple left in our Berlin Marathon. We have Twin Cities and our Detroit Marathon. We also have our Chicago Fall Half Marathon team, along with a new race here in Connecticut, the SoNo Half Marathon and 5K with spots available. We also have many of our virtual events. We have our Dino's Double coming up here in June. We have our Work Harder happening in August. And just recently, we came off of our third annual Charity Golf Classic, which was a record year. We look forward to being back next year for the fourth annual Charity Golf Classic. To learn more about all these great things, how to get involved, we are actually launching events in Connecticut with our urban rappelling over the edge happening in September. But to learn about all these things and how you can get involved here at Project Purple, visit our website at www.projectpurple.org. I think I added a W in there, but that's the caffeine talking. And please follow us wherever you follow on social. Follow us at Project Purple to stay up to date with all the latest and greatest. Without further ado, let's meet our special guest coming to us all the way from across the, as we like to say, well, I don't know who's ever said this. I don't think I like to say this, but they always say across the pond. It's not a pond. It's a very, as my son would say, Dad, it's a very large mass of water. It's a lot bigger than a pond. But coming to us from the UK, pancreatic cancer survivor, Dan Godley. Dan, welcome to the Project Purple podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here. It's a very big, cold body of water.
Yes.
It's not a pond.
Yes. It's I got to do some research on that. Who called that from across the pond? I know that's like a cliche, but it is not a pond.
It's definitely got some Englishness about it, though. I feel like we have quite a weird, dry, sarcastic wit. So even if it was coined by an American, I feel like they did it in esteem of the British. I think it's good.
Yeah, that is true. And I laughed because you hit the nail right on top of the head with that one.
Yeah.
Dan, I want to welcome you to the podcast, and we playing catch up here before we hit record. So you're a runner. You're in the UK. How old are you, Dan?
So I'm 30. I was 28 when I was diagnosed, but I'm 30 now.
For those listening, clearly if you're watching this on YouTube, you can tell Dan's a young guy there. So that's why I want to know your age. You're on holiday. For those that are not familiar with that term, that means vacation. For those here in the US, we call it vacation. I think our European friends call it holiday, which makes it sound, I think, a lot better. Like when people say you're on holiday, it has a better term than vacation.
Yeah.
I'm just going to put that out there.
You have to smile as you say holiday. It forces your face to do it. Whereas vacation's quite long. It takes a while to say,
Well, I also feel too, like here in the US, I can say, so this mindset of like people really look forward to the national holidays. Where I don't know how many people, like I know many friends, I'm not going to name names, but they go on vacation and they dread vacation, for whatever reason. And I'm like, wait a minute, like you're not going to be working, but holiday has just more of a positive tone to it, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So it's just, thank you for taking, and the reason why we're not here to debate vacation or holiday, whichever sounds better, but the fact that you took time to be with us today on the podcast on your own free time where you're supposed to be enjoying life and everything that you're doing is really special for us. And all jokes aside, We were talking before too. I think the power of this podcast, from an international perspective, we've had so many guests, and this is like something that's really special to me as the host, to have this idea to bring people on the podcast that are fighters and survivors, really survivors, of this thing called pancreatic cancer, but from all over the world is really, really special. So it's an honor to have you on here, coming to us from the UK.
It's a very important thing to do what you're doing, because I know from my experience of going through it, it's very hard to find positive stories around this cancer, almost impossible. And that's why any opportunity I have to do things like this, whether it's my time or otherwise, I always grasp at it. It's the same with, I don't know if you know the charity Macmillan, but I'm a victim. There's not an official title for it, but I go to events for them basically, and I talk about my experience. I did a big event to Santander, the bank, last week that was about 400 people, and you have to make time for things like this, and it's incredible what you're doing.
Well, don't thank me. I'm thanking you, because without you, the story doesn't get told here, right? I mean, let's be honest. And, this is, as I was saying before we hit record, this has just been an amazing way for us. I've always said, as I was saying before we hit record, like I get to talk to the survivors. I get to talk to the doctors. I get to talk to the participants. And sometimes that's a challenging thing to articulate that to the public. And when we always hear awareness, like, let's raise awareness.
Yeah.
My opinion is, hey, the best piece of awareness that we can do, talk to the survivors.
Yeah.
Right. And this is what this podcast has become. Hopefully, as I said to you, Dan, before we hit record, like, it's like this library, right? Like this directory of sharing everyone's journey and everyone's, fight with pancreatic cancer. Because I do know everyone handles it differently from an emotional standpoint, from a mental standpoint, but then also, like, this disease is so different, man. It's such a complex disease.
Yeah.
Even for the scientists and the clinicians that are on the front lines of finding cures and finding better treatments and early detection, that even we've seen, like, from the survivorship standpoint, there are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences. And I think there's strength in sharing those stories, and there's also strength in knowing that, hey, Dan, you're not alone.
Yeah.
Because maybe there's someone in New Mexico here in the United States that's going through that same thing and is going to find strength through your journey.
Definitely.
So with that, this first segment of the podcast is really the guest opportunity to share their journey with pancreatic cancer, how they got to the show today. As I said before we hit record, you can stay at a high level, or you can get into the weeds, and I'll guide you through that conversation. So with that, the mic is yours, Dan.
Cool. So I basically had some slight tightness in my abdomen. I'd describe it as. It was mainly only in the mornings when I woke up, and it would generally go as long as I got out of bed. So I didn't think it was anything that serious, and that was going on for about a year and a half. And I was intermittently trying to get that diagnosed, basically. Like I'd have a day where I'd wake up and it would be particularly, like, I'd never describe it as painful, but like tight, or I'd have like a kind of a bit of a stabbing sort of discomfort in my back in the morning. And I would be like, okay, I need to get this sorted no matter what it is. I'd go to the doctor. I'd have whatever trouble getting it diagnosed, because in the UK, everything's going through the health service. I'm statistically very young for a cancer like this. Then they're just not looking for things like this. They kind of do blood tests, they rule things out, but it would ultimately hit a wall and I would give up again, basically. It would go on for another few months, and I tried to get it diagnosed probably 4 times. One time I actually went to a hospital for an appointment. I had an ultrasound on the front, but if you know anything about the pancreas and pancreatic cancer, you're never going to find it doing that, basically. I didn't know this at the time, obviously, but they told me we can't see any lumps. We don't think it's cancer. So I was quite happy generally. And I thought this was a difficult to diagnose, I don't know, something like a food intolerance or something like that. And I wasn't too worried about it. Things changed very quickly. So one day, it was about October 2021. I'd been at the gym. I'd been running earlier that day. I was feeling fine. Went home. I ate dinner that my wife had made me, or girlfriend at the time, wife now. And I just got this crazy pain all over my abdomen. I was struggling to breathe. And that's really where things changed quite significantly. So for the next few weeks, this would happen not every day, but maybe once every few days or something like that at first, but then started getting more frequent. And then I wouldn't even need to eat for it to happen. It would just, like, I would be struggling to stand up straight when I was walking. And at this point, I went to A&E, which is like the emergency department in the UK. And that kicked off a big process, basically, where they did some blood tests. They identified that my liver functioning was very poor. They didn't know why. I got warned that they might have to do emergency surgery that day, but then I got passed into the next stage of that process, which was where you get seen by a kind of specialist that night, who said to me, basically, we can admit you to hospital, or we can send you home and you can come back tomorrow, and we'll take it from there. So I went home, came back the next day, and then basically there was 5 weeks of me going to hospitals. They had to refer me to a different hospital because they didn't have the specialism after a week of tests, where they identified this wasn't something that was simple. At this stage, they were still saying it's very unlikely to be cancer, but we can't rule it out. And then eventually the turning point was I got sent for a PET scan, which again, I didn't know much about this at the time, but I asked a friend of mine who's a doctor. I said, well, they're sending me for a PET scan now. And that was the first time I got a bit of a reality check that this is maybe not going away soon. He basically said to me, look, I don't want to scare you, but a PET scan is a very sensitive scan. It's good that they're doing it, but they're also quite expensive, and they are specifically used for detecting cancer, and they will only use them where they're pretty sure that this is cancer, basically. So that was the first time that I'd really confronted the fact that I might have cancer. I was then told I did have cancer after that scan, but they told me it was a slow-growing soft cell cancer, they think, but they need to do a biopsy to confirm that. I had an endoscopy, which is where you get a camera down the throat. They took a biopsy of it, and a few days later, I got an emergency call basically saying you need to come into hospital now. I was like, why? What's happened? They told me they're not allowed to tell me on the phone, basically. I got rushed into hospital. I was at my parents' at the time, away from London, because my next consultation wasn't until midweek the next week, and this was Monday. So I was planning to go back later that day, but wasn't in a rush to. So I had to, basically, my sister urgently drove me the 4 hours from my parents' house down to London. We were on a time pressure because we had to get there before 6, because that was when the staff were going home who were dealing with my case. So we weren't sure we were going to get there in time. I was physically struggling to talk at this stage because I was so ill, but also I was so scared because, I've had this call saying they've got news. And then they told me I had pancreatic cancer, stage 3, said I need to go straight into chemotherapy, said that I need the chemotherapy to do a good job if I have any chance of getting surgery. And they essentially told me that I was up against it, essentially. I was not in a good position. And that's how I was diagnosed.
Or October 2021.
2021, yeah.
So this was in COVID. So this is during the
Yes.
pandemic.
Yep.
So not only are you dealing with all this, but you're dealing with
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah. It was difficult, and I think that's probably partially why maybe it didn't get resolved earlier. To be honest, like,
Yeah.
trying to go to hospitals at that time was difficult. A common issue that I'm sure you're aware of from doing this podcast and from just generally knowing about pancreatic, if you've spoken to anyone who's kind of younger with it, but it's very hard to get taken seriously for this cancer when you're
Yep.
young. So that a combination of those things, yeah, it was. I mean, it was difficult. And dealing with the cancer itself. I mean, so then I went into chemotherapy. I did 7 months of chemotherapy because I had a few delays.
Yep.
But I had to do that. No one was allowed to go on the ward with me, so you're doing that on your own. Whereas usually, I think you're allowed. I think it's one person on the ward with you for that, but couldn't have that. And then I did get the surgery, which was actually very surprising because even yeah. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no. So I just want to jump in here. So
Yeah.
you do the chemo. From October 21st, just from a timeline perspective, to when you're starting chemo, how long did that take?
So that was actually very quick. So I was diagnosed at the start of November when I actually got diagnosed, because it took so long going through all those tests and stuff. I was in chemotherapy a week and 4 days from then, basically. Yeah, it was really quick.
So they got you moving pretty quick once they got that official diagnosis.
And they had to do a procedure in the bit before as well, where they had to put a stent in the bile duct, because the reason I'd fallen so ill suddenly was something had happened. Yeah, basically, I think the tumor had either got to a certain size, or I don't know what happened, but the bile duct was then getting blocked, which was making me really jaundiced, and that was the turning point. That's where I got ill, and where I had to actually go to the emergency room, and where they started saying, okay, something's going on here. So they did that procedure. I got admitted to hospital upon being diagnosed. I was there for 3 days. They did that procedure the day after I was diagnosed. I was out the hospital the following day. And then I was having my first appointment with the oncology team about 4 or 5 days later, and then I was in chemotherapy 3 days after that. So it was quick.
So you do the 7 months of chemo.
Yep.
And then what happens then? You do scans, and then they come back and say, "Hey, Dan, we've got great news. You're surgical. You're a surgical candidate."
To be honest, it wasn't even that positive. It was they did scans, and they said the chemotherapy doesn't look like it's done enough. This tumor's still completely surrounding a major artery. Mm-hmm. They said because of my age and my health, because I was running 100-kilometer ultra marathons 3 months before this. I ran a marathon 1 week before I went into hospital, into the emergency room. I'd done an event. Like, I was really healthy at this time. They basically said to me, because of your age and health, they said, we can't not do something and see what happens. So they basically said they're putting me forward to the surgical team anyway. They're going to see what they can do. They said the worst case scenario is they go in there, it's too difficult. They use nanoknife to try and kill some cells, but then basically close me up and we see what happens. Quite incredibly, I woke up to the news that the surgeon said it was the biggest operation he'd ever done on for the pancreas. I was in surgery for 14 hours. They had to take out my entire pancreas, so I had a total pancreectomy. But to get out the tumor and get good margins on it, they had to take out 3/5 of my large bowel, some of the stomach, some of the liver, the gallbladder, the spleen. I think that. Oh, and they had to reconstruct 2 major arteries as well. that's what it took basically. But they managed to get the full tumor out and get very good margins on it.
Wow.
Unbelievable.
So that is unbelievable
It
because
is. Yeah.
so I got to ask this question.
Yeah,
Going
of course.
in, they're saying Whipple, and for our audience, if you've never heard, this term, the Whipple, that's the main surgery for. There's a couple of others like a distal that they'll do and other variations, but the Whipple is the main surgery for
Yeah.
pancreatic cancer removal. So before you come out and before you go under, was there
Yep.
talk about total removal, or was this like, hey, we're going in for a Whipple, and like you said, nano knife potentially if it looks good, and then we close you up? So there was no conversation about like, hey, we're gonna yank this out and we're gonna redo these arteries. It's gonna be this complex. So you're
No.
waking up and you're thinking, okay, either it went well or it didn't go well, but this was like a third option that wasn't even on the table.
Yeah. So it wasn't even broached. I didn't know it was possible.
Yeah.
I woke up. I mean, I can't pretend that I remember, to be honest. Like, I was under a lot of drugs. They had to put an epidural in my
Yeah, I would
back
imagine.
day
Yeah.
2 because basically they went in not thinking they were going to be doing an operation that big. But then upon going in and the surgeon deciding, okay, look, we're going to go for this, whatever it takes to sort it. But they didn't kind of do the appropriate pain
Yeah.
procedures for the level of operation that they did. So
Yeah.
apparently when my wife and my mum came to visit me the day after I was out of surgery, I was screaming in pain, and they were trying, because obviously to get an epidural in, I'm saying obviously,
Yeah.
maybe it's not, but you need it in the back. And the
Correct.
surgery, it's a huge cut across your abdomen that they do.
Yeah.
They're trying to push me over on a bed to get an epidural into my back, and yeah. So it was a bad situation basically, and I was in a lot of pain. Apparently, I remember it now. I remembered it at the time, but I was in hospital for 2.5 weeks before I got out. But then when I got out, I had to go straight back in anyway because I felt very ill. And it turns out I had loads of problems, to be honest. It wasn't any one thing, but yeah.
Dan, I gotta imagine that. So we've had people come on that have had Whipples, and I know. So my dad had a Whipple.
Yeah.
He was much older.
Yeah.
Much, much older. I mean, he was 68 when he had his Whipple. But my dad was a pretty strong dude. Like, he was a laborer. He used to sling, bricks and mortar and wood and all that stuff. So he was very fit for his age.
Yeah.
But we know the Whipple is a no joke surgery.
No.
When you describe what you went through, regardless of what physical shape you're in prior, this is like no joke. The Whipple is a no joke, and that's probably not the proper term. The Whipple is a major surgery to recover from.
Yeah.
I can imagine, so having a complete removal, which now I assume you become diabetic right away.
Oh yeah, I'm
now,
very.
Let's throw that.
It's an aggressive type of diabetes.
Correct.
As well. That's very hard to manage.
Correct.
Yeah.
But then you're talking about reconstructing arteries and all the other margins that are out there, this is like major, major, major surgery, and there's so many moving parts. So just how long did that take for you to recover from where you felt comfortable enough even moving though, Dan?
It's honestly still ongoing in a lot of ways, but I'm feeling healthier now than I have in a very, very long time. But I've had to go back into hospital 4 times since coming out fully for various issues. Like, one of the big problems I have is any surgery that's done on the bowel leaves scar tissue.
Yep.
that basically causes your bowel to, it's not even just as easy as, if you eat a big meal, get blocked, it gets caught on itself quite easily because of that buildup of scar tissue. And then if that doesn't sort itself out over time, I mean, that's death, right? Like, that's a serious issue. And that's besides the pain element of it, which is genuinely in incredible amounts of pain when it happens. And that's happened 3 times. So that's straight back into hospital. Go on.
That's like a bowel restriction, then, I would imagine that.
Yeah.
Basically, not to get graphic here, but you're getting backed up because it can't pass through. And when you don't have a pancreas, you're not secreting probably the digestive. I know with the Whipple, a lot of patients deal with the digestive issues because of the enzymes that are no longer being. And this is. So let's talk about this for a second. I know here in the United States, there are drugs that are used, like a Creon, which are like digestive enzymes that are added. So I know here, as you show the audience, you have the Creon bottle. I know here the cost is insane. So not only, so we're talking, there's a physical aspect, your plumbing's all reworked. So now you got to figure out a new way to eat, a new way to do all this, and hopefully your body digests it properly. But then you've got this added supplement that I know here costs insane amount of money. Like insurance, sometimes these copays are, I've heard anywhere from like $1,500 to like $5,000 a month just for the drugs that keep you digesting food properly.
That's where I'm in a very blessed position because in the United Kingdom we don't pay for that.
Correct.
And I have medical exemption. It's unbelievable to fathom how anyone in the United States goes through this. Honestly, I really feel for people going through this there because, like, as you say, the stress of everything is difficult enough. Having to throw on the financial stresses, which this has given me financial stresses. There's no doubt about that. Like, I couldn't work for pretty much a year, and no companies, no matter how nice they are, generally, they're not in the business of propping up people for no reason, right? Like, they don't pay you to be off work for a year. So I've had financial stresses with this. If I was having to pay for my medication associated with this, I don't even know if this operation is possible when you throw in that element, to be honest. I think it's just all of it's too expensive. Like the diabetes medication is expensive, I would imagine. The Creon is, the actual surgery itself, I mean, it required 3 different very specialist surgeons to do this. Like, there was a vascular surgeon, there was a surgeon who specialized in, pancreatic surgery. There was another specialism that I'm not sure of, but those people, because of the NHS, are at hand. They can literally call another department in the hospital and say, we need you to come in, we're doing this surgery, we need this type of specialist advice. I don't think that's possible if your healthcare is privatized in the same way.
No, and it costs you an insane amount of money.
Oh, well,
right? Like that's the trade-off. So you go through this surgery, you have this crazy recovery. Do they do radiation, chemo, or after, or like once you're come due, you're in a state, do they say, hey, Dan, we got everything looks good, you don't have to do any more treatment, but you've got to deal with the reality of what just transpired, of removing your pancreas and all these other things that we had to reroute?
So I did do mop-up chemotherapy. So my surgery was in July last year. I started the mop-up chemotherapy in, I think it was October. I had quite a big gap, but the mop-up chemotherapy was 3 months. And honestly, even though it was a way easier regime, like during the first chemotherapy, I was in hospital every 2 weeks for anywhere from 4 to 6 hours for the FOLFIRINOX. the mop-up chemotherapy was only one session in the hospital for about an hour every week. And then I took tablets twice a day, every day for three weeks. So it's you go to the hospital for your infusion every Friday. I was doing it for 3 weeks. In between, from the first one, you take pills every day for the whole of that 3 weeks. Then you have 1 week break. It was 3 of those. The first cycle was generally okay. Towards the end, it did start getting a bit more tough, but it was generally, I was thinking, oh, okay, if it's this, it's okay. The second cycle, it got bad. Like I was having to delay treatment every week because my liver functioning was bad. I was struggling to eat. I had to go off work, sick again. I'd been back for about 6 weeks. I had to go off again. I couldn't handle it. It was a real slog. But at the end of it, my scans were clear still. I still haven't been told that I'm cancer free. I don't know. They're very hesitant to talk in those terms with this cancer I found. I don't know if that's a common theme in this podcast or in your experience talking to people, but they always use the term living with cancer, saying that this cancer is bad for coming back. But I finished mop-up chemotherapy, had a clear scan. That was in February. I just had another scan 2 months ago or something like that. I had the results of that a few weeks ago, and I'm still clear, basically. So I don't have cancer right now, I believe, but they're always using this phrase, you're living with cancer. And I think they use that 5 years clear mark as it's a bit of a like, okay, after 5 years, maybe you can start, hoping, I think is the way it is. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm still figuring that out. Like why that is, I mean.
You asked the question, do they do that here? So I think it depends on the place, right? But so this is a narrative that we have tried to change. In my eyes, everyone who is alive is a survivor, whether you have cancer present in your body or you don't. Like, I don't know. Yeah. I think it's kind of like this weird thing. Like, I think I get it. Like, society wants to like box people in, I guess, in some ways. But survivorship to me is people who are living life, and not letting the cancer dictate how they live their life. And so it doesn't, like, it's like that thing, like it doesn't define who you are. It's just a thing that happens to you as you go through that, I guess. And I don't know if that answers that question, Dan.
It's just one of those things for me, I think, where it's so strange because everyone who's not been involved in cancer or who even might be involved in certain cancers or certain diagnoses, they get quite a clear line drawn between you did have cancer, but now, you know what I mean? You're like post-cancer and you're in that world. And I've just never got the language around my whole experience has always been so kind of cagey. And I do get it, especially seeing the statistics. Like, I understand why that might be. But sometimes I wonder, like, am I a dead man walking in these medical rooms? You know what I mean? Are they waiting for the bad thing to happen? But my surgeon was an amazing person. And he is the most kind of upfront person I've met through this process. And he really said to me after the surgery, he said, you beat the odds getting the cancer in the first place. You beat the odds getting the surgery with the kind of the prospects from the scans. You then beat the odds being in the surgery and it happening, like the result of the surgery where we actually got it out. He was like, there's absolutely no reason that you won't beat the odds and survive for a very long time, like after this. And I just, those words ring in my head when I'm struggling, and that's what gets me through. But it's difficult learning that, it's not so simple. It's not you have cancer, you got rid of cancer, go and celebrate and live your life like that. That's not how it is, unfortunately. And maybe that's a kind of a silly way to try and view it, but you
Yeah.
cling on to anything, you just do.
Yeah. And, you know, and I think the other thing, and you just brought up a great point though, too, is, you know, there's also, I think as human nature, we feel, and this is again bad on, you know, society, like, okay, you had cancer, you beat it. Now go live the way you used to live. But
Yeah,
as
yeah,
you
yeah,
are proof to that, like you had cancer, you had like this major surgery that, and we'll love to get down on, you know, talk further about this, is like really changed you physically,
yeah.
you know, messes with you mentally.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
but you
yeah,
know, you it's hard to go back to, you know, and I think that like everyone wants, I guess my point here, everyone wants that story, that fairy tale ending, right? Like
yeah, yeah,
you have a challenge and then you're back to, you know, Prince Charming,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah,
or you're
yeah,
back to like that happy ending. And not to say that, I'm not saying that there's not happy endings to this, but life is different, and
oh
patients
yeah,
struggle, you know, like we're talking about Creon. Like, so, okay, so if you're on Creon for the rest of your life, like
yeah.
that's a challenge. Like a lot of people
It
have to
is.
change the way that they eat, because of the dietary restrictions and because of
Yep.
the surgeries that have occurred. So that's a challenge, right? And there's this I think there's this notion with cancer survivorship, and maybe this answers your first question, you know, like,
Yeah,
yeah, I guess 5 years scientifically, and I don't know the science behind it. Maybe I should ask that the next time I'm in one of these clinician meetings, with a
yeah,
bunch of clinicians, why 5 years instead of like, hey, if you have a scan and it's no evidence of disease, like that should be the most important thing. And yes, you continue to scan you know, you continue to have continuing scans, because we do know with a lot of cancers, like sometimes they do come back, whether it's margins or whether it's genetics, right? Which we'll talk
yeah,
about here in a second as well. But there's also this struggle that continues to happen, you know, like my
yeah.
mom's a breast cancer survivor 2 times, and like she struggles with certain
Wow.
things because of that cancer, right? Unlike
Yeah,
pancreatic cancer patients who have Whipple's struggle with the digestive piece. So
yeah,
I don't know, Dan, why that 5 year mark is so critical. I'm sure there's some statistical data maybe that they look at that says like once you reach 5 years, we know statistically that 90% of these people, you know, don't have reoccurrences. So that's the mark we're going to use. But I would love to see the data on that, because I'd love to see like what 3 years and 4 years look like as well.
yeah.
Um, you know,
I,
is it, are
I,
we
I,
talking
I know that every year, or the more time that passes, the less likely it is to come
correct?
back. So I
Correct.
guess maybe it's just a kind of like,
But
you
why is
know,
5 years so powerful though? Right? Why
yeah.
isn't 2 years like,
It's a
so
good question.
statistically, hey, let's play a game here. Like if statistically I can see if it's 20% to compare to 90% from 2 years to 5 years, that's a pretty big
That's a
difference,
big
right?
thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But if we're talking 87 to 90, then you know that's not a big
No,
significance, right? So
no, no.
here's for the audience listening at home, if there's a scientist or a clinician that knows this answer,
Yeah,
and quite frankly, here's the other thing, Dan. Maybe they don't know. And
yeah,
5 years is this benchmark for all cancers. And, you know, this is where I go back to like with pancreatic cancer, it is so specialized, it's so niche in the sense that you need to see a pancreatic cancer specialist because it is
yeah.
different. You can't just go to a generalist.
No.
But I'd love to see the data on that where you could see over the years how that changes statistically, because it would be interesting, and maybe that's the answer to why 5 years is the mark, and maybe there's not that much of a variation from 5 to 6, but there is from 5 to 3 to 4 potentially.
Or even like you say, it might be a really generalist benchmark that they use just to understand over time how survivorship's improved and stuff. And
Correct.
it's probably it is likely that it's come from some arbitrary historic thing, really. But who
The-
knows?
for the 13 years I've been in this, it's always been the five, but to your point, 5 years is always this arbitrary date, right? Like it's this anniversary that everyone looks forward to, and that has never changed, which is kind of strange, but it's maybe another episode on a podcast to figure out
Yeah,
why that
yeah,
5 year
yeah,
mark makes such a big difference. So back to your story. So you've been, clean hair for last 2 scans.
Yep.
Life has changed dramatically.
Yep.
You did get married in the process. I picked up on that,
I did,
which is probably a big moment in your life for you and your wife. What was that like, for given all that you just explained, to have like a moment of that in your life?
So that probably is the part of my journey that actually fits in with this kind of novel style narrative that we were talking about before, where I proposed to her as literally, I got diagnosed, but the doctors stood there, diagnosed me, walked out the room, I turned and I said, let's get married. And that happened a few months after surgery, in September last year. So,
Wow.
It's been 9 months or something. So yeah, it was an amazing thing to do. We were planning it throughout the treatment. It was so motivating to be doing that. My family also bought me and my wife, now girlfriend at the time, a puppy to support me through chemotherapy. So we've got a little miniature Dachshund, or Dachshund, as people like to say, who's wonderful. She's so much fun. We didn't let her sleep in the bed with us for a while, but then we caved, and now she literally pushes her way into my arms when I'm sleeping like this and sleeps on me. Yeah, I think my wife loves her and is jealous of her in equal parts, I think. So there's been loads of nice things, but the wedding was an amazing kind of event. Like, you can imagine the speeches at things like that are emotional anyway. And then you throw in everything that had happened over the last year, and we had 120 of our closest friends and family there. And yeah, most of the room was crying during my speech, as you can imagine. But it was my advice to people fighting this is you need to find things that motivate you to get through it. As much as you need to kind of, actively fight it, you need to find things that actively take your mind away from it and give you reason to push through and survive that extra time, because I don't know what the science is behind it, but it really makes a difference. Like, the weeks where I felt low were horrible, and I'm sure that they were detrimental in some ways to my health, just from that kind of negative headspace, compared to the 95% of the time that I've managed to just fight it mentally in a way where I just get on with my life in whatever ways I can and look forward to things and enjoy life. Like, it's so important.
I want to shift gears here, but stay on this topic.
Sure.
How did you get into running before? Like, what was the thing that got you into running?
It's a thing in my family anyway. My dad was a big runner before he got an injury, and then kind of switched onto cycling, but still does a lot of exercise. And he's 67, nearly 68. But he'd always instilled in us this idea that, look, exercise is, it's not just a physical thing. It's good for your mind. And that's what hooked me, I think. Like, once I started running properly, I always ran intermittently when I was younger, but I didn't stick with it until I was probably in my early to mid 20s. And I just think that something that's stressing you out at work or in your life, if you go out, do a run, spend an hour, even not thinking about it. Sometimes you don't think about anything, I think. Like, afterwards, I couldn't tell you what I thought about for the run, but I just feel better about it. I feel more equipped to tackle it. I feel happier in myself. I feel like I kind of, I've got more of a renewed sense of fight in me for whatever it is that's bothering me. And that's what hooked me, really.
And then you said you shifted, you were doing marathons, and then you shifted to ultras, which I know we talked before we hit record.
Yeah.
I've seen that ultra community, and this is a compliment. Those are some badass people, man. Like to go
Yeah,
beyond 26 is
yeah,
pretty gnarly.
it's a lot. It is a
So
lot.
so what got you going? What pushed you to go into that vertical? Because not everyone does that. I mean, I have a lot of friends. Some of them either like I'm not. Maybe we put them in three groups. It's like, okay, they've done it, they're done. They do, and this is marathoning. They do a
Yeah,
marathon, they're done. Bucket list, check it off. Do a
yeah,
marathon, okay, now it's addicting. Do more, and then you get done a marathon, but oh, there's this other category called ultras.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
then and you can probably go into that same thing too. Like I've known people, they do one and they're like, hey, I did pass the marathon. They do more, or now they go like, I've seen people go like really get into it and do like, I had a guy I knew, like he did one marathon, then ended up doing, now he's up to like 50 marathons, but then he was doing ultras, and then he did, he got into Mount Tremblant and, did like,
Right, yeah,
those
yeah,
crazy endurance races, where you're doing, 100 plus miles over 3 days and, not
yeah,
sleeping.
yeah, yeah. So I think what helps for me is my brother Greg, who's 2 years younger than me, by the way. He is a lunatic, and I think when someone when you know someone who takes it a step further than you, which once you get into that community, you find those people anyway, right?
Yeah.
But mine just happened to be my brother, so I didn't have to look that far for it. He, for example, last year did a double Ironman. So an Ironman is, yeah, it's a brutal version of a triathlon where usually you're swimming 2.6 miles followed by a 112-mile cycle, I think it is, and then
A
a
marathon.
marathon at the
Yeah.
end. So he did double each of those distances all in one go. I think it took him 20, 25, 27 hours nonstop. And they're not flat routes. Like they are made to break people. He was doing it in Snowdonia in Wales, which is a big, I don't know if you can call it a mountain, especially when like the States, you guys have some huge places, but it's big anyway. It's a big
Yeah.
hill, and I think when you're into that community, however you get there, and you see these people achieving more than you could ever have thought anyone could do, right? Like, never mind, you read things in news articles about, oh, someone's broke the record, run 100 miles in bloody 4 hours or whatever, and you're like, that's ridiculous. Like, it's so far
Yeah.
removed from you that you can't even contemplate it. But as soon as you meet people and you speak to them and you hang out with them and you start to, feel like, well, why not me? I could do something like that. And I think when you start to get that switch with anything in life, right? Like when you start proving to yourself that you can do something, it becomes a kind of self-reinforcing thing. And all of a sudden, yeah, it gets on a life of its own. And it did for me. I've done a lot of ultras, anything from 60, 65 kilometers up to the most I ever did was 110 kilometers, and I was training for 100 miles. But I've probably done over 40 easily, I would say.
So vast running, doing these extreme, not extreme, but like these ultras,
Yeah,
best
yeah,
term, right?
yeah,
And that's a mental, like you really need to go into like seventh gear mentally.
yeah,
So this happens often, Dan, here on the podcast for me. So I've been taking notes and just hearing your story and certain words you use in the last year, maybe it's that since you started this journey.
yeah.
Have you ever looked back at your experience? You mentioned your dad instilled this thing of, being healthy and how important health was.
Yeah,
Your brother got you hooked on these ultras,
yeah,
and doing that extreme. And again, from the physical aspect, yes, but from the mental. And I really stress the mental because you really need, anyone who's done a marathon knows it's more mental than physical. And
yeah,
the same could be said. I mean, yes, you do have to put in the reps. It's not like you can go out and run 100 miles or, 100 kilometers, very easily.
Yeah.
You do have to put in the time and the work and have the discipline, but there is a huge mental piece to that.
Yeah.
What you've gone through with pancreatic cancer, have you ever thought like this was the training for what you went through with pancreatic cancer?
I think it's a really interesting thing that I've had to go through to then compare it with like past, it's so difficult because you're stuck in your own head and your own world, and you understand yourself, and you're ever present in the moments where you're feeling insecure, weak, when you really are losing that mental battle with the cancer. You're so wholly aware of that experience that I think it's very difficult for me to feel like I've not accomplished something, because obviously I'm not saying I haven't, but like,
Yeah.
I think people are so complimentary about certain aspects of what I've gone through and how my past might have aided it. And I really try and listen to them because I think it is valuable to get those insights. But I just don't, I almost feel like I'm a phony in that world, because I know that I had those nights where I lay awake and I the day before I started chemotherapy, I was so terrified that that experience was going to be, like horrific. I was sat on the floor in my shower, just bawling my eyes out for 20 minutes, terrified. And yeah, it's so difficult to truly feel like any of the things that helped me in running ultras helped me get through this. But like, it's like I say, it's all those micro transactions you have in your own head throughout the journey. And I think the difference is that an ultra, even when it's long, is 24 hours or
Correct.
30 hours or whatever,
Correct.
This is something that goes on for, it's probably never going to leave me.
No.
Never. It's so crazy to understand how,
but
yeah.
But also life it's not always linear, right? Like there's these blips on the timeline. So like you have these experiences, and hopefully we're learning, and and where I come from this, Dan, is like, again, from my perspective as a listener and just listening to so many stories, like, again, not everyone runs ultras, so it's this different breed. And not to say that this is why, because if you run an ultra, no, but I think it's very interesting to see personal experiences and how people maybe, don't realize like those struggles that we go through early on, or those lessons that we learn in the long run, how they play out in a positive way to help people get through adversity when adversity occurs. And so it's just kind of an interesting picture here that I've written out, and some of the things that I caught on that you've mentioned. I've got a couple questions here for you. I know you do blog quite a bit, right? And you've been blogging about your journey. So let's talk a little bit about that and how that's been helpful for you, and sharing your story and doing all that you're doing there.
Definitely. Yeah. So it really started out as a project because I wasn't working. I didn't have loads of energy because I was on chemotherapy, and I was getting a lot of messages from family and friends asking, how I'm doing, what's going on. So I've always read a lot of books, both fiction and non-fiction. I haven't ever tried to write in particular. I mean, I've obviously I like went to university or school, but I wrote a lot of essays during that time and stuff. It's not like I've never written things, but I've never tried to just kind of write. And I started doing this blog just to communicate kind of to the family and friends how I'm doing to an extent, but also to try and connect with people, because I was struggling to find people, especially anywhere near my age, suffering from this. So it was a bit of an attempt to kind of like reach out and connect with people, which is a very common thing, I think, for anyone who's diagnosed with cancer. A lot of people yearn for some kind of like shared experience, just as people do about any traumatic event. But it started there, and then I think people were generally surprised that the writing was actually so good. I had a lot of people saying to me, "You're a really good writer," like, never mind the fact that, you're saying things that are interesting because I want to know how you are. Like, you actually write very well. So it's taken on a bit of a life of its own. I think it's very max. It had a subscriber count of over 700. I know
Wow.
I have about 400 directly to the blog now, I think. Not because it's fallen, because it used to incorporate how many follows you get on
Yep.
social media, but
Yep.
it's since, for some reason, on Elon Musk's Twitter has broken the link or
Broken
something.
the bots or something. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. So you can't actually connect it anymore. So it doesn't account for those Twitter follows anymore. But yeah, it's about, I think it's 450 or something. And it's changed a bit, like I don't have things to update every week about cancer anymore so much. It's got some stuff about diabetes on there. I actually just write. I have a series which is the On series, which is just on a different topic each week, which is really just for me to play around creatively and write something. I've been writing a few books. I've had a few things published in magazines, like short stories and stuff, which is that's quite a gratifying thing, actually. But it's a huge interest now that really came out of this cancer experience, and that it's just a nice thing to do these days. Like, who knows where it will go generally, but it's good to kind of go through that experience with something that is an outlet, and that has been a huge outlet for me.
It's awesome. I love it. It's just another opportunity to amplify your story, raise awareness.
Definitely.
And I think an important message, right? Because as I said before, like there's like you said, you're now talking more about the diabetes piece, and that's where what I mentioned before. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, I think we're so fixated on like, hey, cancer's over. Okay, now they're okay, but no, there's challenges, there's issues to that, and your age and everything that plays into that. And this is where my next question. I have two questions left, but my second to last question here. You've mentioned this a couple of times. 28, young, healthy, active.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to someone, maybe close in your age? I mean, you said for a year and a half, you had this like tightness, stabbing pain in your stomach. And because of your age and because of your situation, like, no one really kind of thought, pancreatic cancer until, until that crazy episode there in October 21. But would you give someone advice? Like what, not necessarily one thing, but maybe there's a handful of things. Like what advice would you give people to someone listening to this?
I've said it a few times on different events that I've spoken at and stuff, because I do the support work with Macmillan, the cancer charity. Again, I'm not sure if they operate in the US or not, but they're huge over here. They have actual representatives in the hospital that as soon as you're diagnosed, Macmillan representatives come and kind of speak to you and guide you through certain aspects of the process. And I do a lot of talks for them now. You really have to take account of anything that's bothering you, because generally if it's bothering you, it's probably a sure sign that something is going on, right? And it might be a lot more difficult to do in the United States, and perhaps it's a little bit bad advice for people in the United States, because it might be very expensive to pursue things, but also perhaps you can get to a diagnosis a lot quicker there too. Like, probably has some positives that can weigh out some of the negatives too. But I think if something feels off and it's not going away, and learning the symptoms of things that it could potentially be, because if I'd have read around more, not buried my head in the sand so much about, it potentially being cancer, I might have actually seen some of these symptoms. Like, some of the symptoms for pancreatic cancer are like pains in the back, yellowing of the skin even, because when I when things got very bad for me and I was going into hospital, I didn't notice until after a while, but my eyes were going yellow. And even the people at the hospital, that didn't get mentioned to me. I think knowing the symptoms of these potential serious illnesses can make a big difference as well, because it empowers you to actually go to a medical professional and say, look, I'm not saying it's likely, but I am displaying some things that are consistent with this disease. What can we do about it? And I know in the UK, if you do that, if you go to your GP, which is like, the local surgery here where you get kind of minor appointments for coughs and stuff like that. If you go to them and present to them that you're worried it is something, they are more inclined to do something about it. And I think maybe even they have to do something about it at that stage to at least verify it's not that, so long as your symptoms are consistent with that illness. So, knowledge is power.
You just hit a home run there, Dan, because that's we talk about that all the time, the self-advocacy, right? Like you have to, and I tell people all the time, I think the challenging piece is knowing what to ask. But I go back to that is like, if you don't feel right, your body's best, right? And so even that slight like nagging pain that you don't think is a big deal, it's a big deal, right? Treat everything as if it's a big deal, especially with something like pancreatic cancer.
Yeah.
My last question here, and then we're going to share where our audience can connect with you online, social, wherever that place may be. This is always a loaded question, as I like to say. There's no right or wrong to this, but given your experience, what you have gone through yourself, Dan, how do you define pancreatic cancer? How do you define it?
I think it's a very evil, very difficult, very complex machine that, unfortunately, in a lot of cases at the minute, seems to come out on top, and that seems fairly underfunded from what I've understood compared to other cancers. Seems to get written off a lot as this cancer that only affects old people, which has this implied kind of subtext, which is that doesn't matter. And I think when you experience it, if you kind of care to learn about it, you realize that it is a seriously detrimental, difficult thing that needs more attention, and that everyone should take a lot more seriously, because even if it never impacts you, it will be impacting people that are in a network that are associated with you. And if we don't do more to tackle it, one day it just might hit your sphere. And when it does, you'll realize that, wow, it's a seriously horrific thing to go through. It really is. It's anything that impacts that kind of digestive system, that changes your life when you have a problem with it, in a way that the very simplest, most human impulses that you have to sit, eat, enjoy, those raw, very instinctive things change forever when you get it. You'll never live the same life, and unfortunately you'll probably die prematurely, perhaps very prematurely, due to that disease.
Powerful statement. Dan, for our audience listening at home, someone wants to follow along with your blog, connect with you, maybe reach out to you. We have audience all around the world. As I mentioned, we've had guests from many, many countries. So it's vast, and they come from all parts of the world. Where's the best place for people to connect or to follow along or to reach out to you?
So the blog is the best place to kind of just, see what I'm putting out there, read the backstory of what I've been through. It's all there. It's broken into series. There's a Road to Diagnosis series, which is about how I was diagnosed. There was a chemotherapy diary series, which was how I was dealing with chemotherapy. there's just random writings where I'm a lot more light and don't talk about cancer. Like there's a lot there. And then if you want to talk to me personally, which I love talking to people, I think it's a great thing to do. I've met a lot of people. Some of them have actually become friends in real life through the blog, but messaging me on Twitter is probably the best. So my handle's something like ebb_and_flow_blog. So yeah, Twitter's the best place to talk to me directly, but the blog's kind of, if you're just interested in the backlog of the story or anything like that, that's the best place.
And the blog is ebb/and/flow.blog.
Yeah. It's got hyphens between the ebb
Correct.
and
Hyphens,
flow.
yes.
Yeah, that's it. So ebb-and-flow.blog.
Awesome. Dan, it's been an honor to have you here on the podcast to share your journey. And I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share what you've gone through and hear about your story. You've said it a couple times, and this is part of what we try to do here at the podcast is, I mentioned awareness, but really bring conversations like yours. You're 30 years old, man. This is, everyone thinks it's this old person's disease. And, I don't see that.
No.
We've had guests here in their early 20s. We just had someone on the podcast who's in their 30s. So I have never, other than my father and clearly people that I've interacted, but this is not an old person's disease. Yes, does it probably impact statistically more old people? Yeah, I guess, we can say that. But just because you're 28 years old, you're an ultra marathoner doesn't mean that you can't get pancreatic cancer. And that's really the important piece here, right? Is that
100%.
You could be a professional athlete in getting the latest and greatest in all recovery modalities and training methodologies, and you can still get pancreatic cancer.
You can. No one's immune from it, unfortunately.
Well, thank you for coming on the Project Purple podcast. Thank you for being public and sharing your journey and inspiring people there in the UK and across the world here on our podcast. It's been an honor to have you here on the podcast, Dan.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Project Purple podcast. If you like this episode, feel free to share this episode. Make sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure to follow us on YouTube. Thanks for listening to the Project Purple podcast. That's a wrap of another episode.